Okay, I see that the recording started. So I read the article by Gambrall, which was called "Is Culturally Responsive Pedagogy Enough Towards Cultural Relevant Curriculum?" And so the big idea behind it was really about trying to recognize, or he argues that we should be recognizing students' spiritual worldviews um, in a similar way that we do culturally responsive teaching. Um, and that basically by ignoring that, we are neglecting the spiritual identities of students. Um, I had a very hard time with this article because, you know, I'm such a firm believer in the separation between church and state in public schools. And I felt like, it was hard because I could see what he was talking about in terms of, there are kids who their faith is such a part of who they are as an individual. And if they're not part of the primary religion in that school, that can impact them in a negative way. But at the same time, I was struggling with the idea of sort of opening those floodgates um, and in schools because I feel that like too often people use religion as a weapon, unfortunately, um, and and that sort of barrier that protects the schools from that sort of aspect of um, what's become more part of political life, I guess. Um, to me, as a principal, I appreciate that because it keeps things cleaner. But I struggled with it because I do understand that, for many people, our faith is such a huge part of who we are. So I'd love to hear your ideas on it because it was just one of those things where I was super uncomfortable reading the article. And you know, I was struggling because, of course, like my own religious background is in the majority in my school, and so I had to accept that, like, okay, there's something to the experience of somebody whose faith might not be represented in the majority that could put them at a place of discomfort or feeling ostracized in the school community. So
I mean, I guess I'll probably open it up to, you guys who work in K through 12. I think I shared in different times that, just the educational environment that I'm in, I think that it is certainly more intentionally inclusive of just different perspectives and lenses and the way that people see the world. And so, I would have limited experience kind of with, everything that you talked about, Trish, as far as keeping it cleaner, in the name of, your unique kind of environment. So, I would love to hear it too. I just think that for me, I come from a different space where that's not something that I have to always consider navigating.
Yeah, I love this topic, and I think it brings up the question that I think needs to be asked before this is like, how do we delineate spirituality from religion? And especially at our younger grades, I do love the idea of teaching the whole child and looking at them as spiritual beings. However, there is a very thin line between spirituality and religion. And sometimes there isn't a line, and a person's religion is their faith and is their spirituality, and that is it. So I think I would caution, honestly, um, moving towards embracing religion, especially if there's a dominant religion. And now I think we're moving further away from cultural responsive teaching instead of the intended impact of embracing all in which a child brings culturally, linguistically, and spiritually to the educational spaces. Yeah, I mean, I do think there is room for that. I personally was raised in a dominant religion, Catholicism, but I've since I more practice the Unitarian Universalist, which is a very liberal, non-creedal religion that embraces all, spiritualities and beliefs. But yeah, to me, I think that would be the bigger question. Like, are we defining this as just spirituality or religion? And I still think that there needs to be a clear delineation of that.
And Lori, something that you just referenced is like you've switched your religion from one to another. And a lot of the times when we talk about our identities, there are things that we can't switch about ourselves, right? You can't switch your race, you can't switch your gender. So this is one that felt a little challenging, because could you potentially be influencing somebody away from one religion to another, because that is a choice?
I mistakenly read the same article, and I had the same reaction. I was like, nope, I'm gonna disagree with this so hard. I went into it and thinking, man, all those other subjects we've talked about, so challenging. And this one is like one where, why would you have to dive in? We have that separation, like you said. But somewhere in the article it says that, we talk about the things that are fundamental to students, and what is more fundamental really than someone's spirituality, in part because you can choose that, and you do choose that. So it's something you have so much more control over. I think it really, in a way that those other things, race and what was the other one I was thinking of? Whatever.
Gender, or sexual
Race,
identity,
gender,
or
social identity, all those things, you have so much less control over often. So I think it is important. And one thing that I pulled from the article was that, again, if we just go back to like, what is good teaching? There's a bunch of studies that say when you include that spirituality element, student outcomes improve. So, it seems like, again, that's just part of good teaching, and we can't ignore that one thing because it's more uncomfortable maybe than the others. It's definitely extremely challenging. I mean, what an area wrought with landmines. But I think what it boils down to for me is, Gambrall points out this difference between differentiating between the how and the what. So, we talk about how to teach these things, but not what to teach. Are we being culturally responsive, or are we doing things that are culturally relevant? So some of that is by nature, and like we've been talking about throughout this course, like it really depends on the students. Is it relevant to your students? How is it going to, get them to think more critically, to engage more, to be better learners in the classroom, and to be better citizens in the world? But man, I went into this one thinking like, nope, I should have picked a different article, and clearly I should have, because we were. But I'm right there with you on this one.
I'm curious to know what the article actually suggested that educators do to navigate this, because just to echo the sentiments that you guys have already kind of said, my instinct as an educator when it comes to religion is just don't touch it with the 10-foot pole. I'm not saying that's the right way to handle it, but I do think that as public school educators, we're kind of told to just stay away from the entire thing. I've had one situation with religion. So I had to teach the Crucible, which is about the Salem witch trials, and it explores the devil and how Salem believed that the devil was present in Salem. And I had a Jehovah's Witness in my class who could not read the book. So my directive from admin was to just send him to the media center for every class throughout the entire unit and give him a different book and just grade them separately. I had to create separate assignments, like do a whole separate thing. So I'm curious to know what the author of this article would say is an appropriate solution for that type of situation.
That's what a tough situation, and what a bummer for that kid, and what a bummer for you as a teacher. That must have been really challenging.
Was.
I don't know. I guess, and you know, let me know what you think. But my takeaway after reading this would be, you know, in the case of just nope, that kid can't read that because we know this book and because those words are used. I don't know what you do, especially in those areas where, like, I know, especially teaching high school, like there are some things, some books you need to read to be able to respond to these high stakes tests. So, you know, it's not always your choice. Like as a teacher, you're really putting your kids at a disadvantage if you don't address that material. So I guess you can't not do it. And if the parents say, no, that's it. But for the rest of those kids, will it be tough? Probably. Pull out the things that you think are important to, create conversation, to get the kids to think critically, to get kids to, really think about, well, why is that an issue? Why maybe is that something that makes me feel uncomfortable or might get me upset or my classmate upset? Why is, what are those things that are happening? What are those mechanisms? And so many of these things say, oh, I feel like on one hand, it's like, it's really tough as a teacher because they will not tell you what to teach. On the other hand, like, well, no one can tell you because it really has to be in response to the students and what's going on. So it's a challenge. Of course we say, no, we can't prescribe exactly what to say and exactly what to do and hand you lessons. But in the same breath, that's what all that high stakes testing does.
See, I think, from my takeaway would have been that if that sort of barrier of church and state were removed from here, that Gambrall would have advocated for that kid to be in the classroom and to use it as an opportunity to explain the contradictions between one school of thought and another school of thought. Because by moving that kid out into another setting, it's like ostracizing that child and that part of their identity from the rest of the group.
Right. And I think this is exactly where this becomes a really tricky issue, because while I may agree that I think, especially from a young age, introducing students to various perspectives, religions, cultures, traditions, all that, I think just serves to benefit just humans in general. The more we're exposed and aware of differences, I think the more we can understand one another and then come to a place of agreement. However, but with that, if that is, say, against that individual's religious belief or practices, and they are going against their religious teachings, then that now becomes like, if we do expose them or we do have them participate, even with good intent, is that then not being culturally responsive because we're not honoring what their religion calls them to do?
Mm-hmm.
That's where it gets tricky.
That was really well said. Just for lack of a better word, I think dealing with religion in the classroom is awkward.
Yeah.
I think the big thing is, like, how do we get students talking about that? You know what I mean? Why is so maybe, you don't have to get into the debate of is God real or, which religion is best or whatever, but like, why why are those stories written? Why is this a faux pas in our society? Why was this book written at that time? You know, what was the underpinnings of that? Especially, you know, I went to a Catholic Christian undergrad, and I had to take a religion course. And even there, I was really surprised because I'm not religious, and I was really surprised how it was handled in a very like open way. That like, yeah, why were these stories written, and you know what's going on behind that, and no one ever. Granted, again, this is kind of like Bryan was talking about at a higher ed level. It's a lot easier to have those conversations, but you know, I would have loved to have those conversations in middle school, high school, and they were either avoided or, you know, just, you know, in the case of like I grew up going to like catechism, and it was just like jammed down your throat. So I would have loved to have those conversations sooner personally.
Yeah. No, I think that, yeah, even like I talked about like the unique space of higher education, because I teach in a graduate school. So when you think about critical thinking, it's even more encouraged, you know, at the graduate level, you know, versus kind of the way that I had to interpret my article. And I chose it because it was focused on higher education. It's called Design Matters in Higher Education. So I really wanted to see what that was about, because I thought that it would be, you know, really more reflective on my positionality and experience. But when I read it, what I really took from it was more focused on like core curriculum, or, you know, kind of like those core courses that everybody has to take in undergraduate courses. And it talks about, how important design is in making sure that, you know, curricula, even in higher education, is accessible and then more inclusive, for all college students. And they use these concepts of inclusive design and design justice, right? And talked a lot about those, and how, you know, higher ed educators, or just at least their learning environments, there's got to be intentionality and making sure it's tailored to serve all students, especially students who come from historically oppressed and marginalized backgrounds. And so even like my time, so full time I teach in a graduate program, but on the side I teach adjunct, like an adjunct course with undergraduates, but it's more of an elective for these students. And so, you know, in kind of opening those spaces for students to, again, kind of have the discussions in the curriculum better reflect or be more representative of who they are based on what they've experienced coming through K-12. It's the first time that students have had an opportunity to dialogue around things like race, socioeconomic status, religion, sexuality, all those kind of things. And so as a facilitator, I'm really intentional with the undergrads of opening up the space to make it safe. But you see a lot of discomfort from students that come in because they're like, it's either been, you know, kind of dissuaded or not allowed, or something that I've kind of been conditioned to be really uncomfortable talking about anything that goes against like the status quo. So, go ahead, Francis. Ask away.
Not what I meant to do.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm like, okay, right across.
Well, that's what I meant to do.
Oh, okay. That's what the article, you know, is saying, kind of, that if you center in curriculum, maybe the needs, the educational needs, or the voices and the lived experiences of your most marginalized and oppressed people in the classroom, by proxy, everybody's needs gets met, right? Like if you talk about lived experiences of people of color or Native American people, or any other, you know, oppressed and marginalized demographic, you know, that is also going to be inclusive of the ideals and values of dominant social groups. So, you know, their needs, their educational needs get met as well. You know, so what this is saying is that we need to challenge the status quo and critically examine the design process, not only in instructional design, but also to curriculum design, by sitting back and reflecting on who's going to benefit the most from this, also who's going to be excluded, right? And so when you share some of your stories, it's like sometimes that is lacking. Like we can think about, you know, who's going to benefit from it, but are we really working from a space of who gets excluded from this? And so they talk about like participatory design as a key tenet in this, and making sure that you honor the lived experiences and voices, you know, in the curriculum design. So again, you know, like that is better reflected and representative. And kind of in this theme over maybe like the last couple of weeks, and also to my readings I'm doing in the 7316 class, it inherently makes the learning more engaging, and the learning outcomes begin to change because people can feel and sense themselves woven into the fabric of the curriculum. And so even in higher education, when people are going through those core required courses, maybe until you get through electives, I could choose a Black history course if I want to as an elective, but like when I'm going through the basic history, English courses, things like that, those are less reflective of diverse identities. And so it's even calling on higher education, particularly I think at the undergraduate level, to just make sure that they're reimagining the way that they design curricula as well. So, so for you folks in K through 12, it's not just what I got out of this. It's not just something that you're dealing with or often speak about this unique space that I'm in, but it's probably because it made me reflect on how, because I sit in a graduate school where that critical thinking is more encouraged, maybe not so much in core courses at the undergraduate level. So, yeah.
I love that statement that you said about like being reflective about who's included and who's excluded. I thought that was just such an interesting, like, foundational question to ask when you're starting to design something. And I always appreciate like how you talk about the differences between K-12 and higher ed, because like I don't have that experience working in higher ed, and and you're right, like when you're going into higher ed, like it's about the clients, right? I mean, and yes, K through 12 should be about the clients too, but it's like the clients kind of have to come to us, you know? And when you're thinking about, designing curriculum, you want to meet the needs of the people who are going there. And not that K-12 shouldn't be, but I love that perspective of thinking about that from a higher ed perspective.
Yeah, well, thank you for that.
The more you talk about it, the more I'm like, we just need to be doing this earlier. I mean, the critical thinking part, especially the classes that made me do that, regardless of what it was about. Sometimes it was math, sometimes it was humanities, sometimes it was language arts. Like those are the courses I remember. And to avoid those topics means to avoid that opportunity to like think critically. We talked about this last week too, like if you don't talk about those things, you don't give students the opportunity to like think critically about them, to put themselves in other people's shoes, to have different experiences. And how often do you guys use like the Pythagorean theorem? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We go through and we like memorize all these things, you know what I mean? Or how often do you just discuss, the World War II in the Pacific? Like it's of course we need to learn those things, but those should be a framework to create opportunities to create that critical thinking, not a bunch of facts we learn to avoid the critical thinking.
And that's what I think that a lot of the feedback that I get, I'm just speaking in particular from the undergrads, again, who take the courses as electives. And a lot of that, comes from my positionality, as a Black instructor. A lot of them haven't had those, to kind of speak from my lived experiences. I infuse that a lot into those undergrad courses that I teach. And like you said, for instance, a lot of them will go away and say, you know what, I'll have students write on evaluations like that everybody should be taking a course like this because it encourages me to talk about things that I've never felt comfortable talking about, before. And so I'll get students, there's a couple of electives. And so some of them take me for a few other courses. And when they leave, they're like, you really gave me some things to think about. And again, to examine all the information I've been fed through media, through socialization, through the school system, how do I begin to break that part, break that stuff apart, and to be able to get my own information, to be able to arrive at, whatever my conclusion or thought processes are. And so I get that feedback a lot from undergraduate students, for sure.
Hearing about your experience with higher ed really emphasizes for me the fact that sometimes in K-12, the academics are so divorced from the human experience, and that is a disservice to the students because the way we understand content and the world is all through our lived experiences. And so, this idea of responding to students' different spiritualities and religions is really the same thing as trying to honor their lived experiences and how that affects their understanding of the content. So it would be interesting to think about why there is this attitude of divorcing human nature from the academics when really they are one and the same.
It's nice and said.
Thanks.
Does that lead into anybody else's article, Amanda or Lori? No, Lori, you.
Yeah, I can. It's not as seamless as a trend, but my article, I think, gets more into the how to implement culturally responsive practices versus like the why and like the importance and the potential impacts it could be. So the article that I read, if it's all right that I go next, is the Marshal Khalifa article, Humanizing School Communities, Culturally Responsive Leadership and the Shaping of Curriculum Instruction. So just a little bit of an overview. This article was the result of a 6-month-long case study on one particular Midwestern district. So I just want to preface that where there were some insights gleaned from the study, but this is a very kind of niche and specific insight that came out of one particular case study. There was a extensive literature review, which did also provide some insight as well. But again, I think it's important to look at this through the lens in which it came from. So the big idea of the text was to explore how leaders shape and promote culturally responsive practices. So not only was this a lens through a particular study, but really looking at it through how can leadership drive the change towards culturally responsive teaching practices. So through the literature review process, 4 leadership domains emerged and were cited extensively throughout the article. So one of those 4 domains that emerged from the literature review was that it's important for leaders to be critical self-reflectors in which they are constantly examining their own biases and reactions or non behaviors or submissive behaviors during transformative power so that they can acknowledge their own privilege and how they are impacting the change. The second one is how leaders need to and should involve community advocacy and engagement. So talking about the various communities and looking at the student body as even their families as community members, and then thinking how to advocate for various communities and engage them in unique ways. And then looking closely at the school culture and climate. This is number 3, making sure that leaders create inclusive spaces for all students. This is kind of making me think about, what you all were saying, even spiritually and really looking at how do we, create these inclusive spaces. And then the 4th one is that instructional and transformative leadership, where teachers across grades and subjects have to buy into the transformative work. So we've heard, I'm sure this isn't a new concept about the importance of buy-in, and it really starts with leadership, and it's their responsibility to lead that charge and to really make sure that the work is grounded in with buy-in. And it gets into more detail about different strategies and how that can happen. Looking at, I'm just trying to think. So for example, just to go back to like how you can have buy-in is they talk about a structure of leadership. So there are formal implementers. So those are like, your superintendents, your deans, like people really high up. And then they need to then enact what's called intermediaries. And then these are the implementers that the formal implementer is then going to delegate responsibility to, making sure that information is being communicated throughout the chain of command or the vertical spine or their leadership right down into the classroom level. So that was just a quick overview on what the article was about. So given my positionality in relation to the curriculum, did this text resonate or not? It didn't. It resonated because as an educator and now being employed at the state level and working with various districts, I can see, and I've had experience with the various leadership models within school districts. So there are some school districts that have, superintendent, assistant superintendent, curriculum directors, EL directors, student with disability, special education directors, and then multiple school-based leadership, and then instructional leaders and in coaches, and then down to the classroom level. And then there are some that have like one person, a superintendent, and then a building principal, and they're leading most of the work. So I see the various levels of leadership, and I see that having an impact on how or influencing how transformative change or initiatives are implemented in school systems. So the article then stresses the impact that instructional coaches, district level leaders, and even policymakers, such as like school committee members, have on building teacher capacity in implementing culturally responsive practices. When you have that distributive leadership model, it helps with buy-in and it helps with educator capacity, which then in turn creates a more effective implementation of culturally responsive practices. The article that I thought it was important to note that when implementing cultural responsive education and practices, that with this particular case study, they had to get over the barrier of in responding to the educator's white fragility. And in doing so, there was a great emphasis on that was a key part of the work. In doing so, they even hired coaches and mentors throughout the training or the implementation process that reflected the identities of the educators, which I thought was really interesting. I would love to get your opinion on that when after I'm done and we open up to discussion. That wasn't something necessarily I understand, but that was something that didn't sit well with me because they intentionally hired white female coaches because they felt that it would be easier for the educators who were mostly white or female to engage in these difficult conversations in terms of cultural responsive teaching. And they felt that that was the way that they could build trust, which in my opinion, I feel like perpetuated an issue with cultural responsive. This could have been, I think, a bigger teachable moment for the educators than it was led to be. And I also wondered if that actually translated into building trusting relationships then between the teachers and then the students, because the students don't have that ability to say, pick teachers that look like them, or like if you're having a hard time getting the adults in the building to trust coaches that don't look like them, how are we then expecting in teaching and modeling the students to trust and build relationship and engage in this work with teachers that may not look like them or come from the same background and experience as them? So I just thought that was interesting. And then I'll try to move quickly through it. And then how can this thinking from this theorist be used in our discussions of curriculum today? I do think that this article can help inform a foundation for conversations on transformative educational systems to ensure that they are implementing culturally responsive practices. I do think it's a reference point to understand how to support the work and highlight what the authors believe are 5 essential highlights. So I think there are 5 practices that are important to implementing culturally responsive practices. So one, that, the instructional leaders believe in their ability to coach responsive practices, improve significantly when policies support the work of the teachers are in place. So when the policies of the district and the school reflect and are emulated in culturally responsive practices, that improves implementation. And then the second is that trust is a prerequisite for any kind of coaching that leads to better responsiveness on the part of educators. So if we are implementing an initiative in culturally responsive practices, there really needs to set a foundation of trust building between the coaches and the educators. And then the third point addresses a difficult necessity, which is unlearning certain behaviors and thoughts that led to more culturally relevant outcomes. So there has to be a process of we say professional learning, but there also, when we talk culturally responsive teaching, there has to be some professional unlearning, and really intentionally talking about the experiences and practices that we have kind of embodied in our educational practices and instructional routines. And now we have to intentionally undo them and unlearn them and understand why, which there can be a lot of resistance to, understandably. And then the last one being that implementation is more effective when professional development and professional learning includes cultural and community liaisons. So it's not like this is a great opportunity to implement and integrate the community, which was a key point that was referenced earlier, in the professional development and professional learning opportunity. Invite people in to share their experiences as they're learning how to implement culturally responsive teaching practices. And I believe there were a couple other key points, but I feel like that was a good overview of the article.
There is so much in there, for sure. I feel like I've heard some of this before in other places, but a couple of things that kind of resonated with me as you were going along were, as the building principal, it's always surprises me how important it is to set the expectation in a school, and how powerful that is. It's something I didn't really understand for several years being a principal, and that just how important it is to communicate that expectation. Because when you do that, if you have the trust of your staff, they know that if they take the risk, you're going to have their back, because you're putting it out there as an expectation. The other thing you were mentioning kind of towards the end about bringing in people and their voices. One of the most important things that we had done in our school when we were doing some of our anti-bias work was we had students. My school's a 3 through 6, and we had students from the high school who are our former students who came down and talked about their experiences through their identities and how it was impacted as they were going through our school, whether it was when they were supported or when they didn't feel supported. And hearing from your own students that your actions as a teacher had either a positive or negative impact on their development was so powerful for our teachers to hear. And it was more important, I think, than any professional development presentation that I as the principal or any outsider could have done. It was like hearing the voices of your own kids and seeing the direct line between the words or actions that you take and the impact that it has on an individual that you know. So.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I would have to think that, that would be pretty impactful too. For any instructor, in a book talk for a different class, there was another, educator talking about the need, or just the the desire for people to give more constructive feedback, as she's looking to grow, just as an educator, just not in the way that she teaches curriculum, but I think that everything you just talked about, Trish, as far as how I made students feel, how did I impact identity, anything like that. And so I think that, yeah, for your instructors to be able to have people come back, whether good or bad, and talk about that, that would give somebody a lot to think about. So, yeah.
There's so much to think about there.
Yeah.
What I'm kind of stuck on is like that size of the district comment. What is the better system to be in to do something like that? I'm right now in a very large system that's necessarily going to be a lot more diverse. But as a teacher, no matter how involved I get with my school, I'm a fry cook at McDonald's level employee. Whereas in a smaller district, when you're talking about only 3 degrees of separation between me and a superintendent or like a governor,
yeah.
That's a very different thing. And I can definitely see like a benefit to both if you have the right messaging coming down from the top. I know sometimes even in a very diverse group, the bureaucracy and just the size makes it very slow moving, and you get kind of pockets of resistance to it, and it's a lot easier to isolate and get groups of bad actors as much as you get, and it's harder to get them out is the other thing, with a big strong union. So I got kind of stuck there and then went down the rabbit hole in my own head, but I'm going to think a lot more on that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Francis, because I think depending on the district size, the roles and responsibilities within leadership, you have more opportunities for, I guess, potential barriers that may get in the way to transformative change or implementing curriculum such as culturally responsive, with culturally responsive practices. And they mentioned the article, which I didn't say, so I apologize, I'll say it now. They did mention common barriers that were noted during when they were looking at the literature and looking for schools that had successfully implemented this sort of change or that did not. So common barriers were that teachers, and you were saying this, Trish, about communicating expectations, teachers just didn't understand the change. It wasn't communicated clearly enough, so that educators who were implementing didn't understand it. They didn't know how to use the said, curriculum, or they didn't know how to use what was being asked of them to do. There was a lack of material or resources for learning. For the culture of instruction was not consistent with requirements or messaging in certain policies. And then as a result, oftentimes educators just got fatigued and discouraged and then lost motivation to engage in the change.
One of the running jokes in our school system is like, we're about to go back for PD, and it's like, oh, did you not like what they said in PD? Just wait 2 years, and they'll be onto a new thing, And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had that kind of feeling. And it's different now, reading all this literature over the last couple of years and, really diving into it. It's different. But often we get these mandates from, up on Mount High, and it doesn't make much sense. It's just like, do this. And, well, why are we doing it? What's the rationale? Why is this helping? How is it helping in my classroom? Does it help my students? Or is this some little fraction of a much bigger piece? Is this a 10-year plan, or is this a 10-minute plan and then it's to be forgotten after the day?
Yeah, there are definitely issues with continuity when it comes to introducing a new initiative. I know that in my experience, we've introduced and rolled out these new plans, and then they stop a couple of years later, and we introduce a new initiative. So those initiatives didn't have time to marinate and develop. So it is just really interesting to think about how the power dynamics affect the rollout of these things. Like when leadership changes, there's somewhat of a high turnover in my district. So we get new leaders, new initiatives, and then things never have time to come to fruition before we're changing initiatives. All right, so do you want me to go next?
Yeah, you got it.
All right, so I had the Rothstein-Fisch and Trumbull article from 2008. And this article dealt with how teachers should best facilitate their assessment, grading, and cheating policies in the classroom in order to be culturally responsive. So this was really, really interesting to think about with the ways that we assess things and how that can be interpreted differently by people with different lived experiences and cultures. So one of the main takeaways from this article was the importance of collective learning. So we know all about the importance of collaboration when it comes to learning. And the article spoke about how it can be really confusing for students when at home they're praised for helping each other. But then in the classroom, the teacher can interpret helping another peer as cheating. And oh, you're giving them the answers. You need to stop doing that. So you can understand from both perspectives, from the teacher point of view, how they want each student to learn independently, when collaborative learning is more important in some cultures more so than others. And the authors do give specific examples of particular countries where collaborative learning is more heavily valued than it might be in the United States. So it's the teacher's responsibility, according to the article, to design assessment, grading, and cheating policies that are responsive to different cultures. And a key takeaway of that was the issue of grading and how the misinterpretation when it comes to cheating from the teacher's perspective versus the students. So one of the really useful things that the article talks about is a very concrete way to solve the issue of this grading issue. So she mentioned how when you grade work in a group setting, it can be really difficult to determine from the teacher's point of view if you should give a whole group grade or grade individually. So the authors talk about how you maybe should consider doing a 50-50. So 50% of the grade would be what the whole group achieved, and the other 50% could be each individual student's personal contribution to the assignment. So I liked that. So some of the other takeaways are the fact that you really have to take into account the variation when it comes to the definition of academic integrity. So again, depending on the student's lived experiences and the home that they grow up in, what they interpret as cheating, they could be chastised by their teacher who is perceiving what they're doing as a lack of academic integrity, when at home they would be praised for the same behavior. So in essence, the article drives home the point that collaborative learning is often more motivational, especially when it comes to taking into account different cultures and how bringing them together in a group setting can help to give students different tasks in the same group and focus on leveraging students' cultural strengths and other talents. So, if you have a group project and one kid is working on the artistry and another kid is working on writing lyrics for a song related to the concept, and another student is a timekeeper. So just how that is such an important way to leverage students' strengths and backgrounds. So I think that, collaboration is such a key point in education, and we all do this a lot in our classrooms. But I appreciated the way that the article tied the issue of collaboration to how teachers need to be aware of how students' cultures can affect the way they interpret your assessment, grading, and cheating policies.
It kind of reminds me of the I think I didn't get a chance to touch base with you, Brian, but we talked about like AI. It kind of reminds me of that conversation, Amanda.
Yep. Yeah, no, I was gonna say my mic was off. I started speaking. I didn't realize that I had turned my mic off. No, but I was saying, yeah, I mean, just in kind of a lot of those themes, like in diversifying not only just curriculum, but also too like ways that we kind of facilitate learning, and I think that in a lot of articles I've read, like the value of like hands-on, collaborative, experiential learning, which really can suit people's, different learning styles or this collection of strengths. So maybe to be able to, bring out different talents and strengths in people. I think that it does have a place, instead of just this individualized, everybody's responsible for something. I think that there's a lot of different skills that can be learned, through that group type learning. But it is interesting to see like the subjectivity that you were talking about and how people interpret that, how they grade that, and how they might, penalize a student or, punish a student or, for something like that. So that was an interesting read. Sounds like it was interesting.
It was.
Yeah.
And it just seems we're moving so quickly towards, we've talked so much about project-based learning, but just, it's not so much about how you get it done. Like that old, oh, you did the math problem, you got it correct, but show your work. It's like, well, if I got it correct, kind of what difference it make?
Yeah.
And I feel like it's a lot of that, conversation about working collaboratively with your peers, working with AI. Yeah, I have the conversation still about calculators with some parents. Oh, well, why are they using a calculator? You're not always going to have a calculator in your pocket. Like, yeah, you are. And you're going to have access to a ton more tools. You're going to have access to people to reach out to for help. And, why aren't we teaching kids to take advantage of those things and to be able to get a really good result? And obviously, there's some things that you need to know. You need to know how to learn how to read, for example. That cannot be a team project, but I think beyond those like really fundamental skills, we should be really encouraging this and certainly not beating it down with accusations of cheating or academic dishonesty.
Right, because I can argue, even teaching, when I was in the classroom with younger students, we did a lot of work, and this goes back to the conversation about teaching critical thinking skills. I think in order for somebody to seek specific information, whether it's in whatever content area, math, reading, science, it doesn't matter. If you have to know and understand enough of the context to be able to understand what you aren't aware of, what you don't know, and then seek the correct resources or ask the right questions. I used to love, if somebody was struggling in my class or asked to help, I'm like, okay, well, before I would offer help, like teaching them what is it exactly about this particular task or assignment that you're struggling with? What is the need that you have that's going to help you get over this struggle? And that creates a sense of agency within that student. So it's a fantastic skill to be able and to teach a child or any student, even an adult, how to seek resources and understand what they're struggling with. It's a lifelong skill that I think is super important. And I love, Amanda, the part that you were talking about, the collaborative and how we need to rethink cheating and like, somebody is like working on a specific, maybe a writing portion or a timekeeper, I think you mentioned, and just have different tasks that are working together to achieve a common goal or assignment. And I remember I was thinking back to when I was going through school, or when my children, who are now older, but were going through school, and it was, well, when they were trying to work in collaborative groups, there was this culture of it wasn't equitable. We didn't all do the same amount, or, oh, they just did that, or I had to present, but no, they didn't have to talk, but then they got the same grade as us. So it's almost like I think that's a cultural or almost philosophical or ideological, almost like awakening, like we have to have, or even teachers have to promote. It's okay that we're all not doing the same thing, but we're all working together with certain skill sets to achieve a certain goal. I would love to see more of, instead of this, like, I did this, so I should get more of a quote unquote grade.
Yeah, I think it's the socialization of collaborative learning, right? Where like everybody should be doing, I mean, and you want people to, contribute in some kind of equal manner. I think that, yeah, that's not in consideration of individualized strengths that, people, bring to table. Some of the group presentations that, are done with some of the undergrads, that I've worked with, is like, some people are really like, they really can put together this amazing visual PowerPoint where I may be the person who stands in front of the class because I'm comfortable with that. This person may not be as comfortable with that. So you put together the visual. This person may be a great speaker. It's all those different things. And so you can learn to appreciate teamwork approach that, kind of isn't encouraged in individualized learning. So I think it's just a way to kind of switch up, or, like the ways that we facilitate learning. But I do think it's an important learning lesson for students, that it doesn't have to be this kind of equal contribution. It can just be this recognition of individualized strengths and how you can still come together and put together, like, quality presentation or material, and how that transfers to different types of life skills as well. So
I think it's interesting to think about how the culture of grading and independent work can affect students' desire to cheat or to use the resources that they have available to them that they might be using in an unethical way. So I do think that when there is so much emphasis on just get it done alone, get the grade, let the teacher see what you can do, that can actually motivate students more to want to cheat, because in their mind, they've just been conditioned to think, well, I just need to get this done in the most efficient and correct way possible so I can get the grade and move on with my life. So I think that's another benefit to that collaborative learning, is there might be less pressure to cheat their way through it, because it's really more about the process there and less about just get it in, do it yourself, and let me see if it's correct or not.
And we've talked so much about citizenry. I think what you said 100%. We don't want people to feel as if, for me to get ahead or to do well, I need to game the system or cheat. And, I can't think of too many experiences outside of those early years of academia where asking for help and working collaboratively and certainly not equally, but playing to strengths like you were talking about, Bryan, wasn't an enormous benefit. I mean, certainly every job I've ever had, certainly every social group that I've ever been a part of, that's been important. It really, if again we're trying to create productive citizens, like, we should really be encouraging that a lot.
So, whether it's using a calculator or asking a peer, these are technologies that we're using in order to get the work done. So I guess a better question than, are they cheating or aren't they, is how can we ethically use the resources that we have available such that we are still doing our own thinking but can feel successful?
Oh yeah, so a lot of food for thought. I think that I think the way that a lot of you broke down your book talks, I'm like, wow, it just, each week when I come here, because I'm always meeting with people who work in that K through 12 world, I think it just gives me a lot to to think about, kind of compare, to the world that I live in. But I thought that what everybody offered today, it just, I'm walking away. Like, I was typing a few things as people were talking, and I'm like, all right, maybe just, do some more, research around that, or, just look more into this. Because I think it all is still relatable, but it's things that I've never had to really think about, or I haven't really thought about, just from, where I sit. So, yeah, so I'm just saying, I have to say good job to all of you.
Thank you.
Is that a dog?
Well, we have a dog saying good job too.
Yeah, my neighbor's dog's out. I'm outside. And then
Oh,
my dog's
cute.
inside going crazy because he hears the neighbor's dog. So I keep trying to mute it as much as possible.
All right, I'm going to pause our recording here.
Okay.